When I opened the door that morning and saw him standing there, suitcase in hand and eyes unsure, something inside me shifted. Not because he looked different from the last time I saw him, though he had grown into himself, but because I wasn't expecting to feel anything at all. Yet there it was, the smallest flicker of attention, of life, like when you think a candle has gone out but realize it's still burning at the wick. I told myself it was just surprise. Just hospitality. Just kindness. But when his eyes lingered on mine for a fraction longer than they should have, when his smile faltered and then returned with a strange softness, I felt the warning. The dangerous kind. The kind that creeps into your life like a whisper and only much later do you realize how loud it became. My husband had asked me to host his nephew for a few days. Said he needed a place to stay while he looked at jobs. I agreed without thinking, the way you do when someone asks something harmless. But looking at him now, standing in our doorway, I had a sudden, vivid understanding. Some stories don't begin with a bang. They begin in silence. With a look. With something as innocent as carrying in someone's bag and offering them coffee. And if I had known then what I know now, that this visit would upend everything I had carefully, painfully built, I might have closed the door. Or opened it wider. But let me tell you how it truly happened, not the version others might believe. Let me share the secret I've kept buried, and the unraveling that followed. Before I do, leave a comment telling me where you're watching from, and answer honestly, have you ever let something in, thinking it was nothing, only to realize later it had the power to destroy everything? It started, like most things in my life these days, with habit. A quiet rhythm. Wake up. Dress. Make coffee. Unload the dishwasher. Feed the cat. The house echoed slightly, as it always did when my husband was gone before sunrise. He was meticulous with time, my husband. Efficient. Predictable. It used to comfort me. Now, it was like living with a very polite ghost. When I came down that morning and saw the note he had left on the counter, I wasn't surprised. He should arrive around 10. Make sure he eats. Love you. It was scrawled quickly, the way you sign off a work email when you're in a hurry. I stared at those 2 words, love you, longer than I should have. I used to write him letters, you know. Real ones. Folded into his suit pockets. Tucked under his pillow. I don't know when I stopped. Or when he stopped noticing they were gone. By the time I heard the knock at the door, I had already vacuumed the living room and fluffed the guest pillows twice. I told myself it was to make a good impression, but maybe it was just something to do with my hands. When I opened it and he stepped in, I realized I hadn't seen him in almost 6 years. He looked older, naturally. Taller, leaner, with the beginnings of scruff on his face and that looseness in the shoulders that boys get when they've outgrown their awkwardness but not yet their curiosity. His voice cracked slightly when he said hello. I remember that, because it reminded me of how young he still was in some ways. But his eyes, they didn't seem young at all. I took his bag and led him to the guest room. We talked about the weather. About how long the drive had been. About jobs, traffic, house prices. The kind of small talk that wraps around something much larger, even if neither of you are ready to name it. He complimented the smell of the house, something about cinnamon or vanilla, he guessed, and I told him I'd baked cookies the day before, though I hadn't. I'd just lit an old candle I found under the sink. As I showed him around, something strange settled between us. Not discomfort exactly, but something aware. Conscious. Like we both knew how long it had been since we saw each other, and how different we both were now, and we didn't know what to do with that space. In the kitchen, our hands brushed as I passed him a glass of water. It was nothing. Absolutely nothing. But I felt it all the way up my arm. That afternoon, while he napped, I sat in the laundry room folding towels I'd already folded yesterday. I thought about how long it had been since anyone looked at me, not just saw me, but really looked. Noticed how I wore mascara even when I stayed home. How I kept my nails short but polished. How I still wore perfume, even if the only one who smelled it was the cat. My husband rarely looked up from his phone these days. He was always working, always connected to some screen or meeting or spreadsheet. And I had grown used to speaking and not being heard. It wasn't abuse. It wasn't cruelty. It was absence, disguised as routine. Comfort, hollowed out over time. That evening, the three of us ate dinner together when my husband returned home. It was cordial. Pleasant. They talked about business, about internships, about whether or not the nephew should consider moving to the city. I cleared the plates and laughed at the right moments, but I felt like I was watching them through glass. Like I was invisible in my own home. When they went to the living room to catch up, I lingered in the kitchen. I rinsed dishes I had already cleaned. Wiped down countertops that didn't need wiping. I told myself I was giving them space. But the truth is, I didn't want to sit between them. I didn't want to be reminded of what I no longer had with my husband, shared jokes, spontaneous affection, eyes that searched for mine. Before bed, I passed by the guest room. The door was slightly ajar, and I saw him sitting on the edge of the bed, scrolling his phone. He looked up. Just briefly. Our eyes met. I smiled. He smiled back. Neither of us said a word. In my room, I stood in front of the mirror for a long time. I removed my earrings slowly. Watched my own hands. Studied the lines at the corners of my eyes. I changed into my nightgown, silk, not cotton. Not for him. I told myself that. Just because it was softer. More comfortable. I turned off the lights and got into bed. My husband was already snoring, one hand flopped over the edge of the mattress like a forgotten towel. I lay on my side, staring at the wall, my heart strangely restless. It was a quiet ache. One I hadn't allowed myself to feel in a long time. I didn't know what it meant. Not yet. But I could feel something had begun. Not in the way you notice a storm, loud, sudden, dramatic, but the way you notice the shift in the air before it rains. That stillness. That warning. That tension. And once you feel it, you can't unfeel it. The next morning, I found myself brushing my hair more carefully than usual. The gesture wasn't conscious at first. I told myself I was simply making an effort because we had a guest. But when I leaned closer to the mirror to touch up my mascara, a small, tight part of me whispered a truth I didn't want to hear. I wanted to be seen. Not just noticed in passing or thanked for dinner. Seen. As a woman. As someone still alive beneath all the layers of time and marriage and routine. Downstairs, the kitchen smelled of toast. He was already there, quietly preparing breakfast. I hesitated in the doorway, surprised. My husband was in his office on a call, the door closed, his voice barely audible through the frame. "Morning," the nephew said when he noticed me. His tone was soft, casual. I nodded, stepped inside, and reached for the coffee pot. Our hands met as he handed me the mug he had already poured, and for a moment, neither of us moved. The contact was brief, but it echoed in my palm long after I pulled away. He was barefoot. His hair slightly tousled. There was something vulnerable about the way he stood there, holding his own mug, watching me without quite watching me. It wasn't flirtation, not overtly. But it wasn't neutral either. It hovered in that uncertain space, the kind that makes your breath catch because you don't know which way it might go. We talked a little about breakfast, about the weather, about his plans for the day. But even that simple exchange felt loaded with something unspoken. His eyes lingered on my face longer than they should have. Mine did too, I suppose. Later, I found him helping in the garden, pulling weeds with a concentration that made me pause at the window. I stood there, watching him work, sunlight warming the glass. He looked up once, caught me watching, and smiled. I stepped back instinctively, as if I had done something wrong. That afternoon, we worked side by side in the living room, sorting old books and decorations that had collected dust over the years. I had asked for help rearranging the shelves, partially because they needed it, mostly because I didn't want to be alone. Our arms reached across each other, our shoulders bumped occasionally. It was domestic. Innocent. Yet every time his hand passed near mine, I felt an awareness I couldn't explain away. At one point, I dropped a frame and we both knelt to pick it up. Our hands met on the floor. We both froze. It was ridiculous, really. Just two adults, both startled by a shared touch. But something in the air thickened. I could feel my heart beating louder than necessary. I looked up at him, and he looked back, and neither of us said a word. He broke the moment first, rising with the frame in hand. I followed suit, brushing imaginary dust from my knees to distract myself from the heat I felt on my face. That evening, my husband suggested we all watch something together. We settled into the living room, him in his usual armchair, me curled on one end of the couch, and the nephew on the other. A safe arrangement. Reasonable. But as the movie played and the lights dimmed, our feet shifted. His sock brushed against my ankle. I didn't move. I couldn't. The contact wasn't intentional. Not exactly. But it stayed. By the end of the film, my husband was dozing. The nephew looked at me, his face unreadable in the flickering screen light. I couldn't look away. It wasn't desire in the way I had known it in my youth. It was something else, complicated, fragile, unwelcome, and yet impossible to ignore. When my husband finally stirred and mumbled something about finishing up emails before bed, I stood quickly, collecting glasses to take into the kitchen. The nephew followed me. In the narrow space between the fridge and the counter, he reached for a towel just as I did. Our hands collided again. This time, neither of us moved. "We should be careful," I whispered, without knowing I'd meant to speak. "I know," he said. Quietly. Calmly. But his eyes searched mine with something deeper than agreement. There was no laughter, no flirtation. Just that unbearable tension between restraint and impulse. I turned away, rinsed a glass with more force than necessary. My fingers trembled. He stayed behind me for a beat too long, then walked back to the living room without another word. Upstairs, later, I sat on the edge of the bed. My husband was already asleep, breathing softly beside me. I stared at the floor, my mind spiraling through 1,000 rationalizations. I had done nothing wrong. Nothing had happened. Nothing but glances. Nothing but proximity. But in my chest, the truth was already blooming like a bruise. I had stepped onto a path. Quietly. Unintentionally. One I couldn't unwalk. The next morning, I stood at the kitchen sink while he stood beside me, refilling the kettle. He asked me how I slept. I told him I hadn't. He said, "Me neither." We didn't elaborate. We didn't have to. Everything was already there, in the silence. That afternoon, we drove into town together. I needed a new light bulb, I said. He offered to go with me. The drive was quiet. The kind of quiet that isn't awkward, but observant. He fiddled with the radio, found an old song I recognized, and left it playing. At a red light, he turned to me. I felt the weight of his gaze, but I kept mine on the road ahead. You were always kind to me, he said. I swallowed hard. You were easy to be kind to. There was nothing else spoken. But I knew then what was coming. Not today. Maybe not even tomorrow. But it was coming. When we returned home, my husband was out on a run. The house was still. I put away the shopping. He lingered in the doorway. I turned. We looked at each other. And then, we kissed. No more. No less. And suddenly, everything I thought was solid shifted. Just slightly. Just enough. I didn't sleep that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, counting the slow, even breaths of my husband beside me. My body was still. But my mind wouldn't stop. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that moment replay, how our lips met, how my heart thudded so loud I thought it would give us away. And worst of all, how easy it had felt. Not reckless. Not wild. Just natural. Too natural. In the morning, I went through the motions as always. Shower. Moisturizer. Coffee. Dishes. But everything felt slightly out of place, as if the house itself sensed something had changed. I kept checking myself in the mirror, as if guilt could be seen in the lines around my mouth or the flush in my cheeks. But there was nothing obvious. Just the quiet, internal ache of knowing I had crossed a line I couldn't uncross. Downstairs, he was already there. Sitting at the dining table, scrolling through his phone, acting as though nothing had happened. I wanted to be relieved. I told myself I should be. But something about his calmness unsettled me. I had expected awkwardness, some sort of hesitation. Instead, he greeted me with a small nod and asked if I wanted toast. I said no. The kitchen felt colder than usual. Or maybe it was just me. I busied myself with laundry, using the hum of the washing machine to drown out the noise in my head. When I passed by the living room later, he was watching something on TV, his expression unreadable. I didn't stop to ask what it was. I didn't want to sit next to him. Not today. I needed distance. I needed time to remember who I was before all this started. Around noon, I drove to the grocery store. It was unnecessary, we had plenty of food, but I needed an excuse to leave the house. To breathe air that wasn't thick with memory. At the store, I moved slowly through the aisles, picking up items I didn't really need. A new sponge. Fresh lemons. A bottle of olive oil. I lingered in front of the magazine rack for far too long, pretending to read headlines I didn't care about. The cashier asked if I wanted a receipt. I nodded, though I would throw it away before I even reached the parking lot. Back home, he was on the phone, pacing the backyard. I watched him through the window as I unpacked the bags. He smiled faintly during the conversation, scratched the back of his neck, looked up toward the sky. I couldn't hear his voice, but I imagined it. Low, even. Steady. When he came back inside, I was chopping vegetables for dinner. He didn't say anything. Just walked past me and poured himself a glass of water. I didn't look at him. My hands were too focused on the rhythm of the knife. But I could feel it, his presence, the slight hesitation in his step, the weight of something unsaid filling the space between us. Later that evening, my husband returned from work, exhausted and distracted. He kissed me on the cheek without really looking, asked what was for dinner, then disappeared upstairs to change. I watched him go. For a brief moment, I thought about telling him something. Not the truth, of course. But maybe part of it. That I felt invisible. That something inside me had started to unravel. But I said nothing. During dinner, Conversation drifted from politics to sports to some renovation idea my husband had seen online. The nephew nodded politely, added a few comments, and mostly stayed quiet. I avoided eye contact with both of them. After the meal, I offered to do the dishes alone. I needed the silence. Needed the clatter of plates and the rush of water to distract me. But even then, I could feel him behind me, moving in and out of the room, his footsteps measured, cautious. That night, when I got into bed, I felt colder than usual. My husband turned off the lamp and curled onto his side, falling asleep almost instantly. I stared at the ceiling again. Counted the beats of my own heart. The next morning, I tried to reset. I cleaned the bathrooms. I organized the spice rack. I even rearranged the framed photographs in the hallway, placing a wedding picture more prominently than before. But no matter how much I straightened, folded, dusted, nothing inside me felt clean. I told myself I was overreacting. That it had been one kiss. A lapse in judgment. A moment, nothing more. But then I remembered how I had leaned in. How I hadn't pulled away. In the afternoon, he came into the kitchen while I was making tea. He didn't speak. Just leaned against the counter, watching me. I felt his eyes on my hands as I poured the water, on my back as I reached into the cabinet for sugar. "I didn't mean to make things weird," he said, finally. I froze for a second, then shook my head. "It's not weird," I lied. He nodded, though I could see he didn't believe me. I didn't believe me either. "We're both adults," he said. "We made a mistake." That word, mistake, landed somewhere deep in my chest. It sounded clinical. Clean. As if it could be swept away like dust on the countertop. I nodded again and stirred my tea too fast, splashing a bit onto the counter. I wiped it immediately. He didn't stay long in the kitchen after that. I think we both understood that words wouldn't fix what was broken. Or what had started to break, quietly, over time. That evening, I stood at the window after sunset, watching the sky shift into deeper shades of blue. My reflection stared back at me from the glass. I looked tired. Older than I felt inside. There was something hollow in my eyes, something I hadn't seen before. Or maybe it had always been there, and I had only just now noticed. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't have a plan. I wasn't plotting anything. But deep down, I knew this wasn't the end. Not of the tension. Not of the feelings I was trying to deny. It had begun. And now, it would continue. Whether I wanted it to or not. The day started with rain. Thin, persistent, unrelenting. I stood by the window with my coffee, watching it trace paths down the glass, listening to the faint ticking of the kitchen clock. There was something about the grayness outside that felt like an extension of the atmosphere inside me. Heavy. Quiet. Stalled. He was still asleep. I knew because I could hear the creak of the bedframe from the guest room when he turned. I shouldn't have known that. I shouldn't have been listening for it. But I was. My husband had left early again, another meeting, another full day out of the house. I didn't even hear him go this time. I found his half-drunk cup of coffee on the table, the paper beside it folded to the sports section. The predictability of it made my stomach ache. Not because it was wrong, but because it was so unchanged. So familiar. So dull. Around 10, I heard the stairs creak. I didn't look up. I kept wiping the counter that didn't need wiping. He entered the kitchen and mumbled a soft morning. His voice was lower than usual, like he hadn't spoken yet today. There was a slight roughness to it that made something tighten in my chest. I nodded in return and gestured toward the coffee pot. He poured himself a mug and leaned against the counter across from me. Neither of us said anything for a while. The silence between us wasn't strained, but it wasn't casual either. It was cautious. Tentative. Like we were both trying to step over something without disturbing it. "I'll head out this afternoon," he said eventually, eyes on the steam rising from his mug. "Visit a friend across town." I nodded again. "That's a good idea," I said. My voice felt thinner than I expected. "Give yourself a break." He looked at me for a moment, then nodded back. We didn't say anything else. After lunch, I decided to go into town for a few errands. Part of me hoped the distance would clear my head, the fresh air might reset something. But the clouds hung low, the rain was still falling, and the streets felt quieter than usual. I moved through the shops like a ghost: milk, paper towels, detergent. Things I didn't need, but bought anyway. I was walking back to my car when I heard a voice behind me. "Out enjoying the weather?" It was her, our neighbor, the one who always seemed to be around when you least expected her. She was holding an umbrella with one hand and a shopping bag in the other. Her smile was warm, but her eyes were too sharp, too focused. "Just grabbing a few things," I replied, forcing a smile. "Must be lively at your place these days," she said, her tone light, but with a pointedness beneath it. "Having young company around?" "Heaps things, interesting." I laughed softly, too softly. "He's a quiet guest." She tilted her head. "Quiet doesn't mean boring." I wanted to ask her what she meant, but I didn't. I just nodded and said I had to get the groceries in before the milk spoiled. We said our goodbyes, and I drove home, hands gripping the wheel tighter than necessary. Back at the house, it was quiet. He had left a note on the counter, just a scribble saying he'd be back before dinner. I stared at the handwriting for a long moment. Then I tucked the note in the trash, hiding it under a used napkin. The hours passed slowly. I cleaned the bathroom, rearranged some cabinets, swept the entryway twice. I looked at the clock too often. I thought about texting him, just to check in, but didn't. There was nothing to say. And too much to say. By the time he returned, it was already dusk. The rain had stopped, but the sky remained heavy. He stepped inside with damp shoulders and a paper bag in hand. "Picked up something for dessert," he said, holding it up like a peace offering. I smiled faintly. "Thank you." Dinner was quiet. My husband called to say he wouldn't be home until late. "Work drinks," he said. "Just colleagues." I told him to take his time, that we'd be fine. He didn't ask what we'd eaten. I didn't offer. After the dishes were done, we sat in the living room. Not close, not far. The television played something neither of us paid attention to. I glanced at him once, and he looked away. Then he looked back, and I didn't. "We don't have to talk about it," he said, his voice low. "I know," I replied. "But I think we should." I hesitated. Then nodded. "I didn't plan for it to happen," he said. "That moment." "I know," I said again. "Neither did I. I don't want to make things worse." I turned toward him, arms crossed over my chest. "Then maybe we should stop pretending nothing changed." He looked at me, really looked at me. "What if it has?" I exhaled slowly. "Then we should be careful what we do next." Silence settled between us again. Not tense, just unresolved. Like a question left hanging in the air. Later that night, after he had gone upstairs, I sat on the back porch with a blanket around my shoulders. The air was cool and still damp, but I didn't mind. I watched the trees sway gently and listened to the distant hum of the neighborhood. Everything looked the same, yet nothing felt the same. I thought about the way he looked at me. Not just yesterday or today, but from the very beginning of his visit. That quiet attentiveness. That respect mixed with curiosity. It had stirred something in me I hadn't realized was dormant. Something that wasn't just about him. It was about being noticed. Being wanted. Being known. But that didn't make it right. I closed my eyes and tried to picture my husband the way I used to. When we first met. When I couldn't wait for him to come home. When the sound of his keys in the door made me smile. I tried to summon those feelings, but they came back hazy, like an old photograph left in the sun. I wasn't in love with the nephew. That much I knew. But I wasn't entirely sure I was still in love with the man upstairs either. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the dark ceiling, I realized something I hadn't admitted before. This wasn't about choosing between them. It was about finding myself again, under all the years, all the compromises, all the quiet mornings. And I had no idea where that would lead. The following morning began with a kind of silence that didn't feel accidental. It wasn't the quiet of routine or habit, but something more deliberate, like we were both trying not to step on the fragile balance that had settled between us. I moved through the kitchen methodically, measuring coffee grounds, filling the kettle, watching the steam rise and twist until it disappeared. He entered the room just as the water began to boil. His footsteps were softer than usual. I heard them before I saw him, and still I didn't look up. I focused on pouring the water, watching the dark liquid bloom in the French press like ink spreading across paper. He reached for 2 mugs without asking, setting them down beside me with quiet precision. His proximity wasn't close enough to be inappropriate, but it wasn't distant either. I could feel the warmth of his body near mine, feel the way the air shifted slightly between us, how it always seemed to hold more weight lately. I pushed 1 mug toward him, our fingers brushing again, and for a moment everything stilled. There was a pause, brief but undeniable, before we each pulled our hands away, as if we both feared what might come next. We stood in silence, drinking our coffee. I kept my eyes on the window. Outside, the yard was soaked from last night's rain, the soil dark and spongy. The neighbor's cat padded across our patio, pausing to glance inside, tail twitching, before disappearing behind the fence. "I think I'll go for a walk," I said after a while. I didn't wait for his response. I just needed to move. I slipped on a jacket, grabbed an umbrella, and stepped outside. The cool air kissed my skin. The sky was still overcast, the clouds low and pale. The world smelled clean, but not fresh, more like something waiting to bloom. I walked slowly, past trimmed hedges and quiet driveways. I passed the neighbor's house. Her car was gone. A small mercy. I didn't want to face her eyes, the way they always seemed to know more than they should. By the time I returned home, the house was filled with the smell of toasted bread and something vaguely citrus. He was making lunch, his back turned, sleeves rolled up. There was something so ordinary about it, and yet nothing about it felt ordinary anymore. He looked over his shoulder when he heard the door close behind me. "Hungry?" I nodded, setting down my umbrella. My clothes were damp at the edges. I took off my jacket and hung it near the door, then washed my hands slowly at the sink, taking longer than necessary. We sat at the table and ate. It was quiet again, but not uncomfortable. There was something gentle about the moment. Something suspended. He told me about a podcast he had listened to while I was gone. Something about city planning or architecture. I didn't really register the details, but I listened to the sound of his voice. It was steady, thoughtful, surprisingly calm. The way he talked made him seem older. Wiser. More grounded than I remembered from his younger visits to our home. I told him about a local gallery reopening next week, how I used to volunteer there. He seemed genuinely interested. Asked questions. smiled at the right moments. And I realized how long it had been since someone asked me about things I used to love. Later, I found myself dusting the bookshelf in the den, though it didn't need it. My fingers traced the spines of old paperbacks, some unread, some read too many times. I pulled one out and flipped through it, pausing at a dog-eared page. A sentence caught my eye, not profound, just familiar. It made me think of a version of myself I hadn't been in a long time. He passed through the doorway just then, holding a half-empty glass of water. He paused, leaned against the frame, watching me as I stood there with the book in hand. I didn't turn. "You like that one?" he asked. I nodded. "I used to." "What changed?" I closed the book. I stopped reading. He didn't press. He just nodded, and we stood there in the soft light of the afternoon, suspended in a moment too quiet to name. That evening, after dinner, the power flickered once, then steadied. We were all gathered in the living room, my husband included this time, tired from work but trying to be present. The three of us sat together, a triangle of distance. The television filled the room with voices, but none of us were really watching. At one point, my husband reached for my hand and gave it a quick squeeze. A casual gesture, routine almost. I responded automatically, squeezing back. But my eyes didn't leave the screen. My thoughts didn't return to the movie. They were elsewhere, drifting, circling, searching for meaning in things that didn't have names yet. When it was time for bed, I moved through my routine slowly. Toothbrush. Night cream. Pajamas. I stood in front of the mirror and examined my reflection the way I used to before going out, measuring the tilt of my head, the curve of my lips, the weight in my eyes. I didn't know what I was looking for. Maybe a clue. Maybe permission. In the hallway, just before turning off the last light, I saw him standing outside the guest room door. He was about to go in. He turned when he heard me, met my gaze, and held it. We didn't speak. I didn't move. But something passed between us in that moment, something quiet but undeniable. And then, without warning or build-up, we kissed. It was brief. Gentle. Charged. And just like that, we stepped further into a space we couldn't retreat from. Not without consequences. When we parted, we didn't say a word. He went into his room. I went into mine. My heart was pounding, not with excitement, but with the weight of knowing we had crossed another line. I lay in bed that night with my hands folded over my stomach, staring at the ceiling, listening to the wind pick up outside. The tree near our window tapped softly against the glass. My husband turned beside me in his sleep, murmured something inaudible, then settled again. And I knew, whatever came next, we were no longer in control. We were just moving forward. Whether we wanted to or not. The morning after the second kiss felt different, not dramatic, not full of panic or shame, but eerily quiet. I moved through the kitchen as if everything were the same, but I could feel the difference in my chest, in the way my limbs moved, slightly slower, slightly more deliberate. Like I was trying not to make too much noise inside my own skin. I prepared coffee for one, then hesitated and poured a second cup without thinking. When I heard the soft creak of the stairs behind me, I didn't turn around right away. Instead, I focused on the steady motion of stirring in the cream, watching the liquid swirl like weather. He entered, still barefoot, hair slightly messy, eyes not quite meeting mine. I handed him the mug wordlessly. Our hands didn't touch this time. We were both being careful. We sat across from each other at the table, the morning light filtering through the blinds in thin, pale strips. Outside, birds moved between the trees, and somewhere down the street, a dog barked twice and then stopped. The neighborhood carried on like it always did. Only we had changed. I tried to convince myself that nothing had really happened. It had been a kiss. Just a kiss. But my body disagreed. Every glance, every breath in the same room now held weight. Even his silence felt louder than it used to. Around noon, I heard the neighbor's voice drift over the fence. She was talking on the phone, walking in circles around her garden as she often did. I stood behind the curtain and watched her, my eyes tracing the arc of her movement, the way her fingers gestured as she spoke. She paused for a moment, turned toward our house, and stared up at the window as if she knew someone was watching. I stepped back instinctively. That afternoon, I went upstairs to clean the guest bathroom. I didn't tell anyone. I just needed to move. Needed a task. Something to fold myself into. I scrubbed the sink harder than I needed to, wiped the mirror with precision, lined the towels exactly. When I came back down, he was in the living room reading a book. He looked up when I entered. We exchanged a glance that neither invited nor rejected anything. It just held. My husband returned earlier than usual that day. He brought groceries and wine, saying he wanted a nice dinner together, all three of us. I nodded, keeping my face calm, my voice even. He kissed me on the cheek. I smiled. During dinner, conversation was light but distant. The nephew answered questions politely. My husband talked about a colleague's retirement party. I listened, nodded, smiled. My hands were steady, but I was aware of every inch of my body. Every breath. Every shift in posture. Afterward, while the men sat in the living room, I washed the dishes slowly, staring out the window at the neighbor's house. Her lights were on. I saw her silhouette move past the curtain. Something in me tightened. That night, as I lay beside my husband, I felt his arm brush mine. He murmured something, half asleep, and turned toward me. His hand rested lightly on my waist. I stayed still. I didn't move away. But I didn't move closer either. The following morning was warmer. A spring sun stretched itself across the kitchen floor, and for a moment, it felt like the world was trying to pretend everything was fine. He wasn't in the kitchen when I came down. I assumed he was outside or maybe on a walk. I didn't ask. My husband kissed me on the way out, told me he'd be home late again. Meetings. Always meetings. I nodded, walked him to the door, watched him drive away. When I closed it behind me, the silence returned like a tide. I found the nephew on the back porch. He was sitting with a book, his legs stretched out, sunglasses on. He looked relaxed. Too relaxed. And that irritated me. I sat in the chair beside him without saying anything. For a while, we just listened to the breeze moving through the trees, the distant sound of a lawnmower, the occasional chirp of a bird. "Do you regret it?" I asked eventually. My voice surprised me. I hadn't planned to speak. He lowered the sunglasses slightly. "No." I nodded. I didn't ask anything else. I didn't answer for myself either. That evening, my husband called to say he wouldn't be back until after midnight. Something about a late dinner with clients. I told him I understood. I always did. The house was quiet again. Too quiet. We ate leftovers, barely speaking. Afterward, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out into the dimming yard. He approached slowly, setting his plate beside mine. "I'm going out for a bit," he said. "Just a walk." I nodded. "Be careful." He hesitated for a moment, then left. I watched him from the window, his figure shrinking down the sidewalk, disappearing around the corner. I didn't move for a long time. When he returned, the sky had darkened. He didn't say anything as he came inside. I was still in the kitchen, now wiping down the counter though it was already clean. Our eyes met. And then, we spent the night together. No words. No hesitation. When it was over, we didn't speak. He went to the guest room. I went to mine. And the quiet that followed wasn't peaceful. It was waiting. The morning after unfolded with a strange calm, as if the air itself had decided not to move. I woke before dawn and lay still in bed, eyes fixed on the ceiling, waiting for something to feel real. My husband was still asleep beside me, his breathing slow and deep. I watched his chest rise and fall in rhythm, a steady pulse of normalcy in a day that already felt anything but. I got up quietly, careful not to wake him. My steps on the hardwood floor felt louder than usual. The house seemed to amplify everything, the faucet, the kettle, even the sound of my own heartbeat. I moved through the kitchen in slow, deliberate motions, my hands steady but my thoughts anything but. Outside, the early light was barely touching the tops of the trees. The backyard was still damp from dew, the grass glistening in the soft gray light. I stood by the window, watching it, sipping coffee I couldn't taste. I didn't want to go back upstairs. I didn't want to face the guest room. I didn't want to face him. Eventually, I heard the familiar creak of the stairs. I didn't turn. I stayed by the window, pretending to be more interested in the backyard than I actually was. He walked past me without a word, heading straight to the sink to rinse his cup. There was no greeting, no small talk. Just presence. He didn't linger. After a few minutes, he left the room entirely, taking his coffee with him. That was the beginning of a new kind of silence, thicker, more deliberate, harder to escape. By the time my husband came down, dressed and ready for work, I had already cleaned the kitchen twice. He kissed me on the cheek, said something about meetings and traffic, and was gone before I had finished answering. I stood in the doorway after he left, watching the street where his car disappeared. I felt hollow, like something had been scooped out of me and replaced with stillness. Later that morning, I went to the garden. It had been neglected lately, the weeds starting to poke through the soil between the tomato plants and the roses. I put on gloves and knelt down, using the repetitive motion of weeding as a way to silence the chaos in my mind. Pull. Shake. Discard. Repeat. I focused on the texture of the earth beneath my fingers, the way the roots resisted before giving in. It was the only resistance I felt I could control. I stayed out there for hours. Long enough for the sun to climb, for the shadows to shift across the yard. Long enough for my knees to ache and the sweat to gather at the back of my neck. When I finally stood up, brushing dirt from my pants, I saw him standing at the edge of the porch. He didn't speak. He just watched me. His eyes didn't ask for anything. They didn't plead or apologize. They simply looked. And I looked back, unable to disguise the weight that had settled between us. I walked past him into the house, straight to the bathroom to wash up. I stood at the sink for a long time, scrubbing at my hands like the dirt had settled deeper than my skin. The reflection in the mirror stared back at me with too many questions. None of them had answers. In the afternoon, I tried to keep myself busy. I organized drawers, wiped down windowsills, cleaned the pantry. He stayed mostly in his room or out in the backyard, giving me space without being told. And yet I felt him everywhere. In the walls, the floorboards, the echo of every breath. Around 4, I heard a knock at the door. I dried my hands and answered it without checking who it was. Of course, it was her, our neighbor, holding a small container of something warm and sweet. I baked too much, she said with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. Thought you might like some. I thanked her, tried to keep my expression neutral, but I could feel the heat rising in my face. She lingered, her gaze drifting past me into the house. Your guest still around? She asked casually. I nodded. For a few more days. She hummed. He's been quiet, hasn't he? I didn't answer. I didn't need to. Well, she said, placing the container firmly in my hands. You let me know if you need anything. Her voice was warm, but I heard the message beneath it. Then she turned and walked away, the click of her shoes on the pavement lingering long after she was gone. That evening, my husband came home later than expected. He looked tired, distracted. I offered him the food I had prepared, and he ate in silence. The nephew joined us only for a few minutes, claiming he wasn't hungry. The conversation at the table was minimal, mostly polite observations and half-hearted questions. I tried to keep my face steady, my voice even. But every word felt like walking across ice I knew would crack beneath me. After dinner, I sat outside again. The air was warm, heavy with the scent of freshly cut grass and blooming lilacs. The sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the fence. I watched the light fade, inch by inch. He came out after a while and sat beside me. We didn't speak for several minutes. The silence was no longer tentative. It was shared. Complicit. I should leave tomorrow, he said eventually. I turned my head slightly but didn't look directly at him. That might be for the best. He nodded. I saw it out of the corner of my eye. It doesn't change anything. I don't want to make it worse. I closed my eyes. It's already worse. Another pause. Another breeze. I'm sorry, he said, voice low. For all of it. I didn't respond. Not because I didn't want to. But because I didn't know what words would even begin to matter now. That night, when we all went to bed, the house was too quiet. My husband snored softly beside me. I turned to face the window, watching the reflection of the streetlights in the glass. The guest room door creaked open down the hall and then closed again. And in the silence that followed, I felt the weight of every decision I had made settle deeper into my bones. The morning he was supposed to leave, I woke with a strange stillness inside me. It wasn't peace. Not even relief. Just an eerie quiet where the nerves used to rattle. I lay in bed for a while, staring at the ceiling, feeling the early light shift across the room. My husband's side of the bed was empty. I could hear the faint sounds of him downstairs, cupboards opening, a chair sliding back. Normal sounds. Routine sounds. The kind that should have brought comfort. But they didn't. When I finally got up, I moved slowly, as though I were trying to stretch time. Every small task, making the bed, brushing my hair, smoothing lotion into my arms, was drawn out longer than necessary. Part of me didn't want to face the day. Another part wanted it over already. Downstairs, my husband was reading the paper with his usual cup of coffee. He looked up when I entered and smiled. You slept in, he said. I didn't sleep well, I replied. He nodded, already half lost in the article before him. I poured myself a cup and sat across from him, pretending to read the headlines. But the words swam, meaningless on the page. It wasn't until late morning that I saw the nephew again. He came down with a small bag slung over his shoulder, keys in hand, expression neutral. Not forced, not empty, just guarded. Like both of us had agreed silently not to show too much. I'll give you a ride, my husband offered, grabbing his jacket. The nephew nodded. Thanks. I stood there for a moment, unsure of what to say, unsure if I should say anything at all. He looked at me once before leaving, eyes lingering for just a moment longer than they should have. Then the door closed behind them, and I was alone. I wandered the house for hours, unable to settle. I cleaned the bathroom again. Wiped down the fridge. Rearranged a cabinet I had already organized earlier in the week. I opened windows just to close them again. The air felt heavy, thick with everything that hadn't been said. Around mid-afternoon, I walked to the back porch with a cup of lukewarm tea and sat on the swing. The garden was still. The wind barely moved the leaves. I watched a butterfly land on the edge of the planter, stay there for a full minute, then drift away as if it too had better places to be. I should have felt something sharper, something louder, guilt, perhaps, or sorrow, or regret. But instead there was only the ache of uncertainty. Not knowing what to make of what had happened. Not knowing what would come next. My husband returned an hour later. He came through the front door, shook the rain off his jacket, and smiled tiredly. "Traffic was terrible," he said. I nodded. "Glad you're back." He leaned in, kissed my forehead, then went upstairs to change. I watched him go, feeling the strange distance between us. It wasn't anger. It wasn't tension. It was absence, like something had gone missing, but neither of us could quite name what. At dinner, we sat across from each other, passing dishes in silence, occasionally commenting on the food or the weather. He told me a short story about something that happened at work, a colleague's mistake, a client's impatience. I listened, nodded in the right places, but my mind drifted. Later that night, after he had gone to bed, I found myself in the guest room. The bed was still made, the pillow untouched. He hadn't slept in it since the night before. I sat on the edge of the mattress, fingers trailing across the neatly folded blanket. I thought about everything and nothing. About the weight of a glance, the gravity of a choice. About how something could feel both wrong and inevitable at the same time. In the morning, I expected things to feel different. Maybe lighter. Maybe clearer. But they didn't. The sun came up. The coffee brewed. The day moved on. The neighbor knocked around 10, holding a tray of muffins and a look I couldn't quite place. "I baked extra," she said with a smile that didn't touch her eyes. "Thought you might want some." I thanked her, took the tray, and offered one in return. She declined, leaning against the doorway a little too casually. "I saw your nephew leaving yesterday," she said. He looked distracted. "He's got a lot on his mind," I replied. "Don't we all?" she said, with a chuckle that sounded rehearsed. I nodded, forcing a smile. She held my gaze for a moment longer, then turned and walked away, her back straight, her pace slow. I closed the door gently and stood in the hallway, listening to the echo of her footsteps fade. That afternoon, I sat in the living room alone, the tray of untouched muffins beside me. I stared at the wall, at a photograph of my husband and me from years ago, taken on some trip I could barely remember. We looked younger, but not happier. Just different. Less tired. I didn't cry. I didn't want to. I wasn't even sure what tears would fix. That evening, my husband asked if I wanted to watch a movie. I said yes. We sat together on the couch, our shoulders nearly touching. Halfway through, he reached for my hand. I let him take it. His fingers were warm, familiar, steady. But my mind wasn't there. It was still in the guest room. Still in the space between what had happened and what it meant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay awake, listening to the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the rhythm of his breathing beside me. I thought about everything, the kisses, the glances, the silences, the things we hadn't said and the ones we couldn't take back. And for the first time since it began, I let myself ask the question I had been avoiding. Was it about him? Or was it about me? And the woman I had forgotten how to be. It had been 3 days since he left, and yet it felt like the house was still shaped around him. I could feel the absence, not like a hole exactly, but more like a weight. a presence that remained in the air, even after the body had gone. I moved through rooms differently now, slower, more aware of the silence, more conscious of the things I didn't say aloud. The guest room stayed closed. I hadn't entered since he left. Not because there was anything to hide, but because the very idea of being in that space made something twist inside me. So I avoided it. Just like I avoided mirrors and photographs and the sound of the front gate swinging open in the wind. Everything felt too close to the edge of something I couldn't undo. My husband seemed lighter these days. Not that he knew anything. But he was talking more. Smiling more. He brought home flowers one evening, out of nowhere, setting them on the kitchen table like it was something he did often. I thanked him. I arranged them in a vase. I said they were beautiful. And they were. But they didn't move me. He started leaving little notes again. On the fridge. On the bathroom mirror. Just small things, don't forget your walk, or dinner tonight. I smiled when I saw them, responded in kind, but every word I wrote back felt like it belonged to someone I wasn't sure I was anymore. That weekend, we had dinner with friends. The table was crowded and warm, filled with shared stories, laughter, the clinking of glasses. I sat beside my husband and tried to feel present. I nodded, I laughed, I asked questions. But underneath it all, I felt a strange disconnect, like I was acting in a version of myself everyone else expected to see. One of the women leaned across the table and complimented my blouse. I thanked her, then realized it was the same blouse I had worn the day I went driving with him. I didn't mention it. I just touched the fabric lightly with my fingers, then folded my hands in my lap. When we returned home, my husband stood on the porch for a moment, staring up at the stars. It was late, and the night was cool. I stood beside him, arms crossed. We should do this more often, he said. See people. Be out. I nodded. Maybe. He looked at me, his expression soft. You've been quiet lately. I've been tired. You sure that's all it is? I didn't answer. Not right away. Then I nodded again, more slowly. Yes. Inside, he turned on the radio while I changed out of my clothes. The music was soft, something familiar. When I came downstairs again, he held out a hand. Dance with me? It caught me off guard. We hadn't danced in years. I stared at his hand for a moment too long before placing mine in his. We swayed in the living room, the shadows of our movement stretching across the walls. His arms were warm around me, steady. Familiar. I rested my head against his chest and closed my eyes. For a moment, I pretended that was enough. That this was safety. That this was all it would ever need to be. But even with my eyes shut, the images returned, his nephew's face, the tension in our shared glances, the quiet weight of that last morning. When the song ended, we pulled apart. He kissed my forehead and went upstairs. I remained in the living room, the music now just faint background noise, like the hum of a memory that wouldn't leave. The next day, the neighbor appeared again. She stood at the edge of the driveway, waving as I brought in the trash bin. Lovely weather, she called. Yes, I replied. She took a few steps closer. He's gone, I suppose. I looked at her for a beat too long. Who? She smiled, that knowing sort of smile that doesn't quite reach the eyes. Your guest. I always forget his name. Right, I said. He had things to take care of. She nodded. I figured. The way she said it made my throat tighten. Not in fear, but in the quiet confirmation that someone had noticed what I had worked so hard to keep invisible. Have a good day, she added, turning with a slight wave. You too. Back inside, I stood at the kitchen sink, staring out the window at the neighbor's garden. She was back there now, pruning something near the fence. I watched her hands move, steady and sure. That night, my husband brought up the idea of a short vacation. Just the two of us. He said we could use the time, reconnect, maybe go somewhere quiet. I told him I'd think about it. But the truth was, I didn't know what I wanted. Not from him. Not from myself. In bed, I couldn't sleep. I lay on my side, staring at the line of light under the door, listening to the distant sound of a train somewhere far off. I thought about the moments that had led me here, each glance, each pause, each silence that had grown too large to ignore. And I wondered if the damage had already been done, or if I was still holding the match. There are mornings that arrive without sound, as if the day itself hesitates to begin. This was one of them. I sat in the kitchen, wrapped in my robe, hands curled around a mug of coffee gone cold. The sun hadn't fully risen, and the light outside was the in-between shade of blue that makes everything look softer than it is. For a few moments, I allowed myself to imagine that the quiet around me was peace. But peace doesn't linger when you're holding a secret. My husband entered the kitchen while I was still lost in thought. He kissed the top of my head on the way to the sink. I smiled out of habit. He asked me if I wanted eggs. I told him no. He made some anyway, humming a tune I didn't recognize. I watched him move around the kitchen with ease, this man I had lived beside for so many years, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't know what to say to him. We sat at the table together. He ate. I pushed crumbs around on my plate. He asked if I'd given any thought to the vacation he mentioned. I told him I hadn't yet. He smiled and said we could plan it together. I nodded. But even that felt like a lie. Later that morning, I stood at the hallway mirror, adjusting a scarf around my neck, though I wasn't going anywhere. I studied my reflection, my skin, my eyes, the way my lips had started to thin over the years. I wondered if anyone else would look at me and see what had changed. Or if they'd only noticed the surface, the curated normalcy I worked so hard to maintain. I walked into the guest room for the first time since he left. The bed was still made. Everything was where it had been. I opened the closet and found the spare hangers swaying slightly, as if someone had only just taken their clothes from them. I sat on the edge of the bed and stared at the wall. Nothing happened. No great revelation. Just stillness. The doorbell rang around noon. I startled, as though I'd forgotten the world still existed outside my thoughts. When I opened the door, the neighbor stood there, arms crossed, her expression unreadable. I was pruning the hedge, she said without preamble. Saw your husband drive off. Got a minute? I nodded. She stepped inside without waiting. We stood in the hallway for a moment before I gestured toward the kitchen. She followed, her eyes scanning the space like a quiet investigator. I poured her tea without asking if she wanted any. She took it. She didn't speak right away. She just looked at me, as if measuring something. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but purposeful. I know something happened. I don't need to know details, and I don't want you to explain. But I saw enough to know it wasn't nothing. I looked down at my cup, unable to respond. I'm not here to scold you, she continued. Or to gossip. I'm here because I know what it's like. My eyes lifted to hers. She gave a small, tired smile. It was years ago, she said. Different circumstances. But the same ache. The same silence. I swallowed hard. What did you do? I kept living, she said. And I stopped lying. First to myself, then to everyone else. We sat in silence for a while after that. She finished her tea. I didn't. When she left, she touched my shoulder gently, a gesture I hadn't expected. It didn't feel like pity. It felt like understanding. That evening, I cooked dinner like I always did. My husband came home late again, carrying the scent of someone else's cologne from whatever meeting he'd been to. He complimented the food. I smiled. We sat across from each other, speaking in turns about our day. But our words floated like leaves on water, visible, but weightless. After dinner, I went outside and stood on the back porch. The sky was darkening, stars beginning to appear. The neighbor's porch light flickered on. I could see her inside, reading by the window, her glasses low on her nose. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath. The night air was sharp and honest. It didn't ask anything of me. When I returned inside, my husband was already upstairs. I climbed the steps slowly, pausing at the hallway where our bedroom branched off from the guest room. I touched the doorknob of the guest room for a moment but didn't turn it. In bed, I lay beside him and listened to his breathing, steady and unaware. I reached out and touched his hand. He shifted in his sleep but didn't wake. I held his fingers loosely and stared at the ceiling. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring. I didn't know what parts of this life could still be mended, or if any should be. But I knew this, pretending had worn me thin. And there was a difference between loyalty and silence. Between comfort and truth. I had walked a line. I had crossed it. And now, I would have to decide what came next, not for anyone else, but for me. That was the truth.